Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. All right, so what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is November 15th, 2024, about 12:10 p.m. where I'm at right now, and we are reading Chapter 4 of Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson III. This is the 7th book in our Book to React series that we're doing on this channel, and it's been a wild ride this year. We're still going to try to hit 10. I'm more than certain we can hit 10 by the end of this year. And so there's only 3 more left that we have to do. And this book, Afro-Pessimism, has been on my reading list for a while. I haven't read it in a few days. I've been caught up with other stuff, school, work, etc. But really looking forward to knocking it out this weekend. There's only about 3 or 4 chapters left in this story, which is a kind of coming of age story from a Black person who had a very affluent, privileged life, but was still alienated from the world around him because of his Blackness. And he grew up in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. And so that's a very unique time in Blackness. This is sort of like my father's generation. I think Frank and my father are generally around the same age. So this is a peek into a window that's hard for us 90s babies or even 80s babies to understand, and definitely a totally different world than Gen Z and Gen Alpha or anybody else that will come after us. But still, so much of his story I can relate to because, you know, even though the song is different, the notes are still the same when it comes to Black life in America. And Frank's story is very reminiscent of my own coming of age in my early 20s, mid 20s, and stuff like that, mid 30s, like where I'm at right now. And I find a lot of humor, inspiration, and also sadness in the story of Afro-Pessimism. So I'm looking forward to reading this book. And by the way, for anybody who's going to jump into the chat, your comments will be read. If you have a book that you want us to read, put it in the comments as well. We'll try to get to it. And shout out to everybody who will jump into the chat later. So let's start here. Chapter 4, Punishment Park. Where we left off in the story, Frank essentially was palling around with this girl who was his lover. She was older than him by about 16 years. She was a radical Black activist, but she was basically running from this organization that she was trying to expose for doing corruption, basically taking the money from the people and funneling it into a certain lifestyle. She was also running from her neighbor, whose name was Josephine, who was a white woman who lived above her that she used to be friends with until, you know, the girl got upset that Josephine kept entering her apartment. So then the white woman, Josephine, ends up dumping nuclear waste into her apartment below. And that starts a whole chain of events. Essentially, Frank seems to leave this girl, leave her alone, and he ends up going back to college, the college he got kicked out of for his radical political activity. And that's sort of like where we left off. And at this point, Frank is like in his mid-20s or early 20s or something like that. So let's continue. Chapter 4, Punishment Park. Part 1. Copenhagen is a city without scent. Unlike Berlin with its fragrances of bratwurst and beer, shawarma, spits, and strong coffee, in Copenhagen, one is never sure if one is breathing clean air or gusts of organic hand sanitizer. To be fair, Copenhagen's lack of urban grit, even in the center of town, wasn't the only reason I thought my talks on Peter Watkins' iconoclastic 1971 film, Punishment Park, would be much better received in Berlin than in Denmark, the happiest place on earth. I'd been invited to give a presentation at a conference in Berlin. Since the ticket to Berlin required a change of planes in Copenhagen, I made plans to spend 2 days there and then go by road, rail, and ferry across the Baltic Sea from Copenhagen to Berlin to the conference on the 50th anniversary of May 1968. For me, 1968 had been a watershed year. I turned 12 and left the Roman Catholic Church that year, so I was thrilled when 50 years later, I got an invitation to speak at a symposium on art and revolution in 1968 at the Berlin Center of a well-endowed American university. I plan to screen 2 clips from Punishment Park in the Afro-Pessimist workshop set up for Danish activists, the same 2 clips that I plan to screen and critique at the conference in Berlin. Most people under the age of 60 have never heard of Peter Watkins, and that may well be true for most people 60 and above who are not, so to speak, in the movement back in the day. I haven't heard of this film. I haven't, I'm not a big fan of films from like the 60s, 70s. No, I like films from the 70s, but 60s and 80s, I can't really get with. I don't know why. Films from the 70s are top notch, honestly, to be frank. But let me say this. I think there is something to be said about critiquing culture. Nobody's ever asked this, but I don't think anybody's ever thought critically on why Acty and I do the movie reviews. There is an important part of analysis when we analyze culture through film, when we analyze the stories told through film. And when you watch these movies with a critical eye, not just saying, oh, was this movie entertaining or was it not? But when you analyze the themes, the stories of films, it opens up a window into much more of the human experience and soul when you do these film critiques. So I think film critique is important. We're going to continue to do it because there's so many stories that need to be told from the human experience, and also analysis that needs to be done on why certain stories get told and how they are told as well. All right, but anyway, continuing here, Frank says Punishment Park offers a disturbing look at the backlash against leftist activism that emerged in the wake of such events as the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago and the shootings at Kent State University. The plot goes like this. It's the story of Nixon's silent majority seated in judgment over young people who are fighting, some peacefully, some violently, for the end of the war in Vietnam and social justice at home. The story oscillates between the mise-en-scene of the tribunal, which is deciding the fates of activists from Group 638, and the desert, where the convicted members of Group 637 are given the opportunity to travel 53 miles on foot in 3 days with only minimal provisions of water or food under 110-degree heat. They're told if they reach the American flag in the allotted time, they'll be allowed to go free. In a normal courtroom setting, nothing more than the hum of an air conditioner, the shuffling of feet as people make their way to their seats, and perhaps a cough here and there would complete the soundscape. But in the Punishment Park Tribunal hearing, the canvas walls of the desert tent in which the hearing takes place offer the defendants no sanctuary from the invasion of ambient sounds. They can hear the sonic boom of fighter jets breaking the sound barrier over the desert, reminding them of the napalm raids and bombing missions that these planes will make over Vietnam and Cambodia. The tribunal's defendants, such as Charles Robbins, Stan Armstead, and Nancy Jane Smith, Catherine Quitzner, can also hear occasional gunshots, reminding us that the National Guard, the LAPD, and the LA County Sheriffs are out there in the desert hunting down the members of Group 637, and that the members of Group 638, who are, one by one, being interrogated, will be joining them in short order. Midway through the movie, Nancy Jane Smith enters through a flap in the tent where the tribunal awaits. She is handcuffed and flanked on by both sides by a sheriff. She is only as tall as their shoulders. Peter Watkins' British voiceover introduces her to the viewing spectators as Nancy Jane Smith, popular singer and composer. The handcuffs are left on her wrist, and as we hear the chairman of the tribunal confirm with the defense attorney that Nancy Jane Smith wishes to defend herself, the sheriff settle her into a metal office chair facing the tribunal and shackle her ankles to the legs of the chair. Once Nancy Jane Smith is chained to the chair and the proceedings are about to begin, we cut away to Group 637 in the desert. The youths in the desert are suffering from severe thirst, dehydration, and various physical ailments from being exposed to triple-digit temperatures in the daytime and extreme cold at night. As the proceeding intensifies, so does Nancy Jane Smith's confrontational response to her interrogators. The scene ends with Nancy Jane Smith screaming at the tribunal, "How many children have you killed?" as members of the tribunal scream back at her, accusing her of composing songs that sent the youth into the streets to fight and ultimately sent them to be convicted by this tribunal. As the sheriffs lift the chair she is sitting in into the air, she is sitting into the air and carry her out of the courtroom or carry her out of the tent. So yeah, basically they lift her up and say, "Bitch, you gotta go." So Charles Robinson's interrogation opens with him seated in the same chair where Nancy Jane Smith had been seated. He is also handcuffed with his legs. He is also handcuffed, and his legs are also shackled to the legs of the chair. But unlike Nancy Jane Smith's hearing, Robinson's interrogation does not begin with the members of the tribunal asking him questions about his politics, much less his family background or his moral code. The interrogation begins with the chairperson of the tribunal minimizing the size and the political relevancy of the Black People's Army. The scene of Robinson's interrogation cuts back and forth to the members of Group 637 in the desert. At one point in the cross-cutting, we come to a scene where a Black woman and a white man are holding a West German soundman hostage. Police on the ridge above them have them pinned down on the rocks. The lead officer takes aim with a high-powered rifle with the aid of a scope and shoots the white radical, thus freeing the West German soundman. All of the police chase the lone Black woman for several yards. They shoot her in the back several times and then shoot her 6 more times as she lies face down on the desert tent of the tribunal. The interrogation of a Black revolutionary named Charles Robbins continues. The film contains extended footage of his and others' interrogation at a secret location somewhere in the desert due east of Los Angeles, a courtroom inside a tent. A situation that the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950 has made perfectly legal. The McCarran Act authorized the president, then Truman, in an emergency defined as invasion, declaration of war, or insurrection in aid of a foreign enemy, to arrest and detain persons he believed might engage in espionage or sabotage. From the summer of 68, when I was 12, until 1974, when I went away to college, my teachers were the young, heroic women and men who could have played the women and men who were handcuffed, shot, and killed in Punishment Park. After having spent the first 6 years of school at Kenwood Elementary School, named for the all-white enclave where it was located on the western edge of Minneapolis, I was unexpectedly thrust into a parallel universe in Seattle the summer after 6th grade. I had met many doppelgangers of Robbins, Smith, and the unnamed Black woman in the desert who held a German sound technician hostage, all of whom were murdered in Punishment Park. Nancy Jane Smith was 21. The unnamed Black woman could not have been older. Charles Robbins was 25 years old and already a member of the Black People's Army, an underground organization whose name and guerrilla philosophy was close, if not identical, to Assata Shakur's Black Liberation Army. When the summer of 68 ended, my family left Seattle, returning to Minneapolis, to Kenwood, where I started and completed 7th grade. We went away again in 8th grade, this time for an entire school year, a year-long sabbatical for my father, and a chance for my mother to study for her French exam and finish writing her dissertation. We lived in Detroit's St. Antoine projects, not 2 years after the riots and the Algiers motel incident. We were in Chicago when Fred Hampton was gunned down in his bed, and we lived near campus in Berkeley, California, when Nixon bombed Cambodia and Kent State and Jackson State went down. On this trip across the country, I met a doppelganger of the unnamed Black woman whom Peter Watkins had interviewed in Punishment Park when she was on the run. Hidden from the LA County Sheriff's Department, the National Guard, and the police in the split of a rocky crag, she cradles a rifle she had taken from a cop she and her comrade had killed. She's short of breath from running. She knows the posse is closing in. She tells Peter Watkins and his crew, it's a game, man, a fucking game. This whole establishment, you either win or you die. Then there is footage of her sprinting over the flat, hot terrain below where the interview was recorded. The LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, and the guardsmen are chasing her. Off camera, one of them says, "Get the bitch." Then from a ridge above her, one of them shoots her in the back. She is face down in the dust, but they keep shooting and shooting. I met her doppelganger in Chicago the month Fred Hampton was murdered. She was one of the Black Panthers who opened to the public the bullet-riddled flat where he was murdered. 4 months later, my family and I left Chicago and went to Berkeley, where I saw her again. In Berkeley, I never knew what her political affiliations were, but I knew that revolution was her dream. I was 13 and 14 when we were friends, and she was at least 20. She worked at a fish and chips takeout on Telegraph Avenue, halfway between my school and the university. I wanted her to marry me before my parents hauled me back to Deadsville, Minneapolis, when the school year ended. The fact that to take the vows and kiss her, I would have needed a step ladder didn't dampen my desire. Her skin glowed like marble. We laughed and talked on slow spring afternoons. Sometimes I bought the latest edition of Ramparts to the fast food restaurant, and she'd take her break with me. We talked about the stories in the magazine. I tried to impress her by reading what I thought were notable passages from articles on the Chicago 8 trial, demonstrations in Latin America during Nelson Rockefeller's fact-finding mission for Nixon, or the musical demise of Jefferson Airplane. This is the thing, man. Going to Northern California, that'll turn you out. That'll turn you out if you're a young black boy, especially if you go in from a place where you're surrounded by just crack ass crackers and like just ignorance all around you. I remember I went to Cali. First time I went to Cali, Northern Cali. I was in Berkeley, went there for a summer program for university. Was turned out. Was turned number one. Never saw that many Asian people in my life. Never, number one. Did not know that many Asian people existed in America. I was like walking down the street one time and I saw a swarm of Chinese people come my way. Now, being 14, 15, 16, however old I was, living in like Louisiana, like the only time we saw Chinese people is when we wanted sweet and sour chicken. You get what I'm saying? Like to see a whole swarm of Chinese people coming down the street had me feeling some type of way, right? And I can admit that. Another thing, saw some baddies, the baddest live in NorCal. The baddest live in NorCal. Third thing I got to say, being in Northern California, like how I said, you feel the blood in the streets and in the ground when you're walking in the deep South. You feel the same blood in California. You feel the same blood from the trees, from the air, from the ground, but you also get that radical spirit there. I don't know why, but walking in Berkeley, walking on Telegraph, you get what I'm saying? Walking on Magazine Street, you feel me? Like you see like the Black Panther posters, you see like old hippies from the 60s still walking around tripping off LSD. You know what I'm saying? Like we were playing ball in like People's Park and stuff like that, playing chess with like the homeless people there. I don't know how to describe it. I came back from Berkeley, turned up, trying to like write out manifestos and constitutions for like radical organizations I wanted to form in the Deep South that never got taken off the ground. But I was just turned up after being in Northern California. So, yeah, man, that'll do it to you. That'll do it to you. I definitely relate to Frank's story right here. Anyway, continuing here. So it never once occurred to me that a woman in the struggle who was 6 years my senior might not need a little 13-year-old boy as an interlocutor or a would-be lover, that perhaps she was perfectly capable of finding the relevant paragraphs in Ramparts herself, and that furthermore, perhaps she might have actually read the magazine before I bounced and grinned my way in. When on the rare occasion these thoughts violated my space, I look in the mirror holding my chin in my hand and nod. Age ain't nothing but a number, you dig? That's what I would say to her one day. I thought, just not tomorrow. Okay, now it all makes sense. Because later on, Frank gets with this girl named Stella. Stella is the older woman that he was running around with in Minneapolis, and she's 16 years his senior. He's been liking older women. Since he was a young, he's got a MILF fetish. He's got an older woman fetish. He wants to be cougar bait. He wants to be cougar food. Now it all makes sense. Frank, we see you. We see you, boy. Okay, let's continue here. So instead of actually telling her how enchanted I was with her, I fantasized about my future with her while standing in front of my bedroom mirror. Her name was Bernadette. Hey, that first crush is always embarrassing. This is a rule. This is a rule. Never write about your first crush. Never, because it's always going to be cringe. Afro-pessimism, more like Afro-cringism. Jesus Christ, this book. This book. I'm sorry. The Bernadette I know, because I know a Bernadette right now. So all I got is this like older Hungarian woman's face in my head as he's talking about this Bernadette. Anyway, her name was Bernadette. When I fantasized about her, I gave her connections to the underground she never claimed in that fish and chip shop on Telegraph Ave. On the masthead of the Black Panther newspaper, there was always someone on the editorial board who wasn't named. One day, after school at after school in the Panther office. A brother told me that the unnamed person on the masthead was underground. She or he was their link to the secret cells that operated in what he called an offensive defensive manner. I gave that person the name Shirley, and I imagined that she was Bernadette's cousin, and that's on the journey that Bernadette and I would take after we were married. Bernadette and I would raise money and support for Shirley and the offensive defensive operations of Shirley's Black Liberation Army underground cell. In my reverie, Bernadette and I hit all the places my father and mother had brought me to: the University of Washington, the University of Chicago, UC Berkeley, Wayne State University, and the University of Minnesota, bringing the message of nation time. I was wearing shades and a black leather jacket, a cross between a young Bobby Seale and Link Hayes of the Mod Squad. Bernadette is decked out in a black miniskirt, hoop earrings, and her afro's blown out wide and full. Six microphones are bunched together like steel tulips on the podium in the student union. When I make a point and pound my fist on the podium, the steel tulips shudder and the feedback pierces the auditorium. No one has been seated since I raised my fist and warned, if you don't want no trouble, keep your filthy white hands off our beautiful black women. A beautiful sea of black faces roar, and Ofe newsman, Ofe, that's such an old word. And Ofe newsmen in faded raincoats look up in awe at the stage. Conga players at the far end of the stage beat rhythms with calloused palms. This boy's got some wild fantasies, very wild fantasies. Now Bernadette comes up beside me. I edge to the right, and she leans into the microphone. She tells them that she brings them greetings from her cousin in the Revolutionary Underground. Her name is Shirley Jones. My name is Bernadette Jones. That's right, Shirley Jones, my cousin. Now run and tell that, she says to the press below. The pigs say my cousin's on the run, but y'all ready for this? Sparrow voices lace the air with, we ready, we ready. All right, then. Here it is. Here it is. Shirley Jones ain't on the run. She's putting Oinky Oinky on the run. That's who's on the run. Now rescue me if I'm wrong. I'm standing beside her, applauding, saying, rescue me if I'm wrong, into the den. Bernadette holds up her hand. The auditorium begins to quiet, and then I bust that nut. What type of fantasy is this? This is a wild fantasy to have as a teen, and it's even wilder to write it. But then again, I'm not judging Frank. I'm not judging Frank. This is his story. This is his truth. Let's all respect it. Okay. All right. Continuing here. I'm standing beside her, applauding, saying, rescue me if I'm wrong, into the den. Bernadette holds up her hand. The auditorium begins to quiet. Open your windows, Bernadette tells them. That's right. Open your windows and hear Oinky Oinky squealing. Shirley Jones ain't going nowhere, and she sent me and my man, Frank, to tell you that she is right here, you dig? Right here in Babylon. Shirley Jones is in me. Shirley Jones is in my man here. Shirley Jones, okay, hold up. Now, I only got a little bit of time. Bernadette wiped sweat from her forehead with the handkerchief I hand her. Shirley Jones is in each and every one of you beautiful black sisters and brothers. She waits again for them to get as quiet as they can get. She leans in so close the feedback makes her words nearly unintelligible. Y'all run and tell Oinky Oinky he best eat his Wheaties now. She peers down at the press. You got to eat so you can protect yourselves. The reporters aren't sure if she's joking, even though the room is in stitches. Then to the crowd, she says, go back home, grease some pieces, sight some scopes, and blow that pig away when he jumps out of a bag. This is the thing, man. We have to bring back talking about murking cops, calling them pigs, we frying bacon, all that sort of stuff. That was the best part about my youth, listening to music, even though I wasn't around during the Black Panther era. You know what I mean? I was listening to nothing but Pac songs talking about murking cops, straight up killing police. Ain't none of that happening no more. Why isn't the culture promoting killing police anymore? That was one of the best parts. That was like, come on now. That's one of the best parts of like anti-establishment culture, just straight up celebrating the deaths of police officers. Now everybody's too pussy. Come on, man. It's actually, I'm not saying people should go out and kill cops. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying we should bring back the lexicon. Bring back the lexicon. Because when the revolution does jump off, we got to have people already normalized to thinking that. Now we have people normalized to thinking something revolutionary, saying defund the police. Nah, how about we straight up gun the police? That's the point I'm trying to make. That's the point. We need to normalize people into having that sort of mentality. Not saying we want to kill police, but it has to come to a point where, loggers will come to head, if you get what I'm saying. All right, continuing here. The room rocks like a minor quake. One more thing, y'all. One more thing. Hold up. One more thing. My man Frank right here, my husband. This man right here beside me. A young woman from the front row yells, he sure is fine. Bernadette stops. He's still smiling. She's still smiling, but she stops. Okay. My sister, hear me, okay? I'll off a cleanup woman quick as a pig. The whole room breaks out laughing. My husband's going to rap on about the spring offensive and what we need to do to get ready for the get down. Now I ease back to the podium and start to speak again, but it never failed. My daydream always disintegrated when my wife, Bernadette, called me back to the mic. It was during this time, the spring of 1970, that I met Nancy Jane Smith as well. But unlike Bernadette, there is no footage of her murder in Punishment Park. But we can assume that the police on the guardsmen offed her. In the film, Nancy Jane Smith knows she's going to die. She says as much to the tribunal as she gives testimony while she's handcuffed. Nancy Jane Smith may have been in Students for a Democratic Society, but the records of the tribunal don't reflect this. When I met a double of Nancy Jane Smith, she taught social studies at Willard Junior High School in Berkeley on Telegraph Avenue, half a mile from UC Berkeley, and the fish and chips shop where Bernadette Jones worked. She had brunette hair that hung down her back, and her earrings were two blue feathers attached to the piercings. One day, Nancy stood in front of the class in her customary miniskirt and peasant blouse. She asked if we understood the symbiosis between the white woman and American imperialism. First, she explained symbiosis, a mutually beneficial relationship between different people or groups. Then she put a 45 on the Danzit portable record player on her desk. Hard rock licks from a lone guitar introduced a song we all heard. It had just been released in March. Then Burton Cummings, lead vocalist for the Guess Who, started singing American Woman. When the song ended, she lifted and cradled the tone arm. But for the rest of the period, she broke it down, the symbiosis between the white woman and American imperialism through the lyrics of the song. When Nancy Jane Smith enters the tent of the tribunal, the ensemble of questions is ratcheted downward from ethical dilemmas elaborated by a filial conflict, such as class warfare, to moral dilemmas elaborated by familial anxieties, such as the proper conduct of young women and the future of white reproduction, and a general anxiety about the status of the nuclear family. Smith's interrogation is under a constant hydraulics that, through the selection of topics, the distribution of concerns, the emotional weighting and emphasis afforded to questions of sexual conduct instead of questions of institutional power, and the tribunal's preoccupation with mental hygiene, child rearing, and decent versus indecent speech, pressures the interrogation scale of abstraction downward from the political to the personal. An ethical assessment of Richard Nixon's war machine, capitalism's economic disparity, the prison industrial complex, and sexism and patriarchy as manifestations of institutional power and not mere interpersonal practices is shunned in favor of the tribunal members' fixation on the moral hygiene of a young white woman. Ethical assessment is crowded by the hydraulics of moral judgment. Unfortunately, this penchant for the personal over the political and formality over ethics is as much the preoccupation of Nancy Jane Smith as it is for the tribunal, or as it is of the tribunal. The proceedings begin with the labor union official and draft board member, a conservative Chicano, asking Nancy Jane Smith to tell them a little bit about herself. But the herself that they want to hear about is not grounded in her affilial choices, her political affinities, but in the familial world into which she was born and had no say in, that of a well-to-do white family. He says, "You came from a wealthy family and had the best of everything, so how did you end up like this?" the familial pressure on the ensuing interrogation, and the complimentary discourse about the state of her mental health. In other words, this constant pressure to steer the conversation from position and power to identity and personal choices is something that Nancy Jane Smith consents to rather than rails against. Her consent, of course, is spontaneous, meaning not something she thinks out, which makes her complicity in the interrogation scale of abstraction more constitutive of her desire, not less. The unconscious, is a faith-based initiative. In other words, even though Nancy Jane Smith is a revolutionary insurgent, hell-bent on the overthrow of the U.S. government, and the tribunal members are exemplary of Richard Nixon's silent majority, at a deep unconscious level, they are equally invested in the status and integrity of the white family. The tribunal members and the person they are about to put to death care about the same thing, the status of the white family. And this shared unconscious investment drives the interrogation in ways that are more essential than their political and ideological disagreements over revolution and the Vietnam War. Then the FBI agent reads a report into the record that concludes with a psychiatric evaluation that declares Nancy Jane Smith to be a schizophrenic. The implication is that she is a female hysteric and not a real revolutionary. I'll bet your mother and father are really proud of you, says the housewife who chairs an organization called the Silent Majority for a Unified America. But this diminishment of Nancy Jane Smith's politics also works to fortify and extend her relational status. Put differently, her human subjectivity is secured, not diminished, by those attacks as well as by her responses. As counterintuitive as this might seem, the structure of the exchange, and not the content of the exchange, is what affords Nancy Jane Smith the kind of essential relationality that Charles Robbins and the Black Woman in the Desert are barred from ab initio. Right off the bat, the tribunal makes it clear that Smith has a mind about which they are all concerned. We need to bracket the fact that this concern mimics Victorian views of female hysteria. That's not essential here because it cannot extend to Black women, so its oppressive dynamic remains important, but takes a backseat to the more essential dynamic, which is how it fortifies and extends the paradigm of human relations between the tribunal and Smith. Unlike the Black, the slave, Nancy Jane Smith has what Frantz Fanon calls ontological resistance in the eyes of her interrogators, by which he meant the spatio-temporal labors of one subject have transformational potential on the spatio-temporal labors of another subject. This shared capacity for transformation and for recognition and incorporation does not extend to the slave. Just to break that down very quickly, how I understand that, what they're saying is Nancy Jane Smith, because she's white, it's impossible, or people are resistant in their eyes of analyzing her as somebody who can step outside of the norms of what they consider to be white. And anytime she does step outside of those norms, they view her as crazy. And it affects the views that people have on her or the choices that she could make because of her perceived whiteness. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyway, it is important to reiterate that Nancy Jane Smith does not attempt to change the parameters or the structure of the exchange in any meaningful way. When she is confronted with her psychiatric review, she shouts, "Is that your opinion, dummy?" She is then given an opportunity to sing one of her songs. After reciting the lyrics laden with sexual expressions that the tribunal no doubt considers seditious and pornographic, Smith makes a sarcastic remark to the housewife who chairs an organization called the Silent Majority for a Unified America. "Do you know what snatch is, lady?" The remark is meant to have shock value and to establish Nancy Jane Smith's credentials as a liberated white woman at the expense of her older and repressed white female interrogator. This pageantry of strike/counterstrike that ensues throughout Nancy Jane Smith's interrogation betrays a proclivity to imagine political conflict, which is to say a filial, meaning political and institutional struggles, through filial, meaning family frames. Questions of citizenship and state power that would ordinarily be categorized as afilial dilemmas, questions of institutional power, are displaced onto questions that would ordinarily be categorized as filial, questions of family loyalty. The interrogation weaves a tapestry of articulations, connections, transfers, and displacements between filial frames of reference and familial frames of reference, in which the stability of the white family becomes hegemonic throughout the interrogation, while questions of political power, Nixon's war machine, and the scourge of capitalism become secondary at best. What this framing mobilizes is a deep unconscious saturation and naturalization of white family authority as state authority, wherein characteristics of the family are projected onto the social environments in such a way as to allow for no disproportion between the life of the white family and the life of the state. In stark contrast, Charles Robinson's interrogation begins with an assault. In the guise of an assertion, we know from our records that there are only a handful of black militants that are running the so-called People's Army. So begins a member of the tribunal. It does not represent the community. You are trying to overthrow the government, and you're only a handful. The camera then provides a close-up of one of the other men on the tribunal. Unlike the men and women during Nancy Jane Smith's interrogation, this man is not looking at Charles Robinson, the person being interrogated. He is doodling. Another interrogator snarls, "Martin Luther King was opposed to your violence." The opening of this scene is exemplary of the ways in which the master's prerogative, beyond deciding that Charles Robbins and the Black People's Army have not secured a black mandate, goes so far as to designate what kind of politics will be allowed to secure a mandate and what the nature of that mandate will be. All of this transpires prior to Charles Robbins having said one word. In fact, the interrogation closes as it opens, though more emphatically, Robbins is bound and gagged as the tribunal member keeps shouting, "Shut him up! Shut him up!" And a white defense lawyer rises to articulate the ethical dilemmas that Robbins has been barred from speaking since the beginning. On some level, this is the same discursive violence meted out to Nancy Jane Smith, in that the members of the tribunal quash any hope of the interrogation flowering on a rich semantic field of affiliation and ethical assessment of institutional power predicated on competing political and philosophical orientations. In other words, on face value, the kind of arguments that Marxists like Negri and Hart make, that in this post-industrial dystopia in which we have been living since the end of the 1960s, that is, since the end of the golden age of capital, the temporality of incarceration or prison time has usurped the time of civil society for everyone, regardless of race or gender. But unlike Nancy Jane Smith, Charles Robbins is not even given the opportunity to participate in a ratcheting downward of the scale of abstraction, that is, from affiliation to filiation. He is not someone's wayward son in the way that Nancy Jane Smith is someone's wayward daughter. Charles Robbins is not even a human subject, which is to say that he experiences civil society not as a system of laws, codes, and mores that disperse violence against those who transgress its laws and codes of behavior. For him, civil society is a juggernaut of murderous vengeance void of contingency, trial, or debate. For Charles Robbins and the Black woman in the desert, civil society has always been a juggernaut of violence. Civil society has never been a terrain characterized by consent as opposed to coercion. For the two of them, the usurpation of civil society by violence is not a new phenomenon predicated on changes in political economy, such as the end of the gold standard. On the contrary, violence without sanctuary is the sine qua non of Blackness. That goes back to what he said earlier. Basically, violence against Black people or people racialized as Black is so commonplace, so random, so nonsensical that it is the default of our existence and defines how Blackness is meant to exist in the world, not as something that is a characteristic of humanity, but characteristic of anti-humanity, what is not human, to help us define humanity. Continuing here, like Nancy Jane Smith, he is a stimulus to anxiety, but not anxiety of an ideational nature. Like Nancy Jane Smith, he is a stimulus to anxiety, but not anxiety of an ideational nature. It is not as though Robinson's ideas are a threat to a deep-seated idea held by the conservative tribunal. Their interrogation of him is symptomatic of the fact that the only idea he has are the ones he embodies. That is, the idea they have of him. Like my interrogation at the hands of Elgar's mother, Selena Davenport. When I was a child, a woman whose unconscious prompted a complaint about her husband's lack of home team spirit. When my answers ran afoul of her frame of reference, the tribunal has no need for Robinson's actual testimony. His flesh, his color, size, genitals, the biofacticity of blackness, not his philosophical or sexual orientation, is the stimulus to anxiety. There is no need for the tribunal to parse out his rhetoric as they did when, in their filial fixation, they asked Nancy Jane Smith to sing one of her songs for them, or when, in a rare moment in which they granted her the noblesse oblige of official engagement, they asked her what her philosophy of government was. The inability of the tribunal to imagine Charles Robbins as a relational being, their unconscious inability to see him as a human being, as someone imbued with the spatio-temporal capacity to possess relational status, the absence of resistance in the eyes of the other extends to Black people writ large. And I might add, is also the essential limitation of the filmmaker, Peter Watkins, and of the film itself. Black people form a mass of indistinguishable flesh in the collective unconscious, not a social formation of interests, agendas, or ideas. At the beginning of the interrogation, Robbins is told he has absolutely no political mandate, no political effectiveness. Later, he is asked by the same tribunal member, "Why are you leading your people into the mass hysteria?" Which is he, void of agency or in possession of superhuman powers? He is both. He is neither. The truth and where it lies is immaterial. What is substantiated is that the species that sits between them threatens their collective unconscious beyond their powers of speech. Charles Robbins is a phobogenic object, an embodied stimulus to anxiety. Phobogenic is something that is induced or caused by fear. Okay. So the breadth of his agency is so totalizing as to make agency warped, unrecognizable, and without borders. This is the same orientation white people and their non-Black junior partners have towards Black sexuality. A sexual ubiquity and power that is so comprehensive as to make it impossible to speak of it in sexual terms. Something to be abandoned to, given over to, as though jouissance had no beginning and no end. Something to be terrified of, as though boundless pleasure can lead only to death. The Black is held captive in the joy and terror of the master as it whiplashes between negrophilia, as, for example, in the vapid consumption of hardcore rap by white youth in the suburbs, and negrophobia, as in the interrogation, void of meaningful dialogue, of Robbins by the tribunal. It is important to remember that this is not a reciprocal dynamic. Whereas the committee was indeed concerned as to where Nancy Jane Smith would seek her pleasure and how, and was concerned with what ideas motivated her hatred for America, her paranoia after the Kent State Massacre, there is no concern regarding the motivations that underwrite Charles Robinson's pursuit of personal pleasure or political retribution. As a slave, his jouissance, like his political intent, is always already usurped, given over to the power and desire of those who are not slaves. Frantz Fanon reminds us that the Jews, like the white woman, is a phobic object at the level of the ideas others have of their ideas. And as I have argued in Red, White, and Black, American Indians are phobic objects due to their embodied demand, again, ideation, for territorial redress. But the Black is not a phobic object who stimulates anxiety around their articulations, real or imagined, regarding time, the anti-Semitic fear of Jewish financial domination, or space, a conflict over indigenous claims to land. The Black is a threat, to paraphrase Fanon, at a genital level. He's a beast is the most commonly uttered phrase of appreciation of a Black athlete. In other words, anti-Black violence murders, destroys subjectivity, eviscerates the capacity for relationality. Whereas misogynistic and anti-Semitic violence, along with the genocide of indigenous people, exploits and alienates subjectivity without obliterating relational capacity. In other words, the violence that will ultimately kill Nancy Jane Smith cannot be analogized with the violence that will kill Charles Robbins and the black woman in the desert, even if the same gun is used on both species. Though they all will stop breathing, the death for Nancy Jane Smith in no way resembles death for Robbins and the black woman in the desert. The difference between someone dying and something dying cannot be analogized. Very, very interesting way of putting it right there. So basically, like how he's putting it down, how I'm understanding it, right? You know, the anti-Semitism in the world comes from some sort of relation that those in power have with their fear of the other, this being the Jew. Right. In this case, they fear Jews, that they'll take over the media, control finances, and be the puppet masters that control society. The fear of women, I think, goes down very deep. Even though women are a larger percentage of people on the planet, the fear that women will somehow not need men, that they won't need us to be their guardians or stewards over them because we have financial dominance, and that maybe one day women will be financially dominant over us, causes terror in the minds of men who seek to uphold patriarchy. And the Native American or indigenous people anywhere in the world have a certain fear in the minds of those in power, because an indigenous population or a separatist group has some relationship with power in that they want their land back or they want land for themselves. Think of the Palestinians existing in the minds of the Jew, or the Kurds existing in the minds of the Turks, or Native Americans existing in the minds of the white Americans, right? Or basically people who would be classified as Americans now. But this goes back to like something I've said multiple times. When they think of the fear of blackness or anything like that, it comes down to what Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said, genetic annihilation. The white supremacists and people fear their own genetic annihilation. They fear basically their sons and daughters producing black grandkids for them, right? And eventually whiteness disappearing because of the mixing of different peoples, even though we are all one species of people. And the phenotypes that are produced in mixed people can also be found in all different groups of people. But that's their biggest fear, their fear of what they deem pure whiteness having genetic annihilation. And by the way, whiteness will not disappear even if there are a million mixed race people, even if there literally were no blonde hair, blue eyed people today, because whiteness is not an actual category of people. It is a social construct. It's something that we decide to create new white people. For example, the Mexicans, the Guatemalans, the El Salvadorans, the Cubans, the people that are crossing the border now into America have very dark brown skin, and they are now classifying them as white. It's very likely in my lifetime that we're going to look at people who are brown as this part of my hand and say, yeah, they're white. They're white, because that's what's happening now. Whiteness is not real. Whiteness is not real. It is just a category we make up, right? But very interesting points that he's making here, talking about the difference between killing someone and killing something. There's a big difference, very big difference. All right, continuing here in the story. So this is what makes murder, rather than exploitation and alienation, the generative mechanism of the relationship between Charles Robbins and the tribunal. That is the slave/human relation. A paradox is embedded in this murder, in that it can never be anything but murder, but it must be a kind of murder that is comprehensive enough to obliterate the slaves, the blacks, yearning for it and attempts at attaining recognition and incorporation for their spatio-temporal labors, even though the comprehensive nature of the homicide would not wipe black people out altogether. Without black people, human existence would be unintelligible in the same way that cat has no meaning without dog. This is very different from Native American genocide, for Indians are, in fact, humans. Wiping them out empirically does not threaten the stability of humanity, any more than the anti-Semitic violence of the Holocaust would have made humanity unintelligible should the Holocaust have wiped out the Jews. But if blacks were completely genocided, humanity would find itself in the same quandary that would occur if black people were recognized and incorporated as human beings. Humanity would cease to exist because it would lose its conceptual coherence, having lost its baseline other. find itself standing in the abyss of an epistemological void. The Black is needed to mark the border of human subjectivity. Without the pageantry of violence meted out to Charles Robbins and the Black woman in the desert, a pageantry of violence that is not contingent upon their giving the wrong answers to the tribunal, a violence that considers them a mass of flesh, not members of a social formation, there will be no way for human beings to know that they are human. By way of contrast, Nancy Jane Smith will die, that much is clear, but her death is contingent upon her misbehaving sexually and politically. This contingency imbues her death with meaning and thereby rejuvenates her species, the human race, and its most hallowed institution, the white family, even as she lies cold and inert in the desert soil. As Jonathan Lee writes in his paraphrasing of Lacan, death is such an essential and revelatory future moment. One's death is unavoidably one's own. In other words, even when she dies, Nancy Jane Smith's song and cultural ideas will live on, albeit as thorns, in the psyches of her interrogators and the psyches of humans yet to be born. Hence, the efforts of the tribunal to discipline her into a properly Oedipalized young woman. Okay. I understand the strong argument Frank is making for Afro-pessimism, with Blackness seen as the antithesis to humanity. But I think using the same logic, you could argue that womanness is the antithesis to humanity as well. Saying that, you know, women constantly live under a perpetual state of violence that seems to be random, and women by and large have lived much longer under random violence than we as Black people, melanated people that have that can be classified as Black under whatever racial category we have now. We've existed under longer periods of not knowing Blackness and whiteness and race that we know it now than we have not knowing it. Does that make sense? Like, what we're living under right now is a very brief period in time when we look at the history of Black people, right? Because for thousands of years, right, we were the leaders of civilization, right? Ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia and Kush and all of those kingdoms as well. We were the first people to colonize the planet and make claim to every continent. But throughout that time, by and large, as we can see, women were subjugated to the violence of men. Black men at that, being in no matter what civilization and at various levels or degrees. Not saying that every civilization or time in human history was patriarchal, but a lot of it has been. And a lot of the violence that women live under is random as hell from men, right? And I think there's an argument to be said there. Instead of Afro-pessimism, you could obviously make the course that this is feminist pessimism or gender pessimism to some degree. That's to know what is humanity, to know who man is, you have to know what he is not. And what he is not will always be woman, right? Also going to the point here that he's talking about in this film, he's giving the point that the white woman got a much easier trial. The Black man at least stood trial, but the Black woman in the film was shot down in the desert like a dog without a trial at all. So you could argue that there is Afro-feminist pessimism in the sense that, you know, while there are some issues related to being a Black man in this world, being a Black woman is an even much tougher stance to be. And if women have been the subjects of a longer stretch of random violence under human civilization, and Black people have existed under probably the most brutal form of oppression that humans have ever conjured, and have also taken away our humanity at that, then you could argue that Afro-pessimism really boils down to Afro-feminist pessimism, and taking the Afro out of it, because not everybody from Africa is Black. We could say Black feminist pessimism could be a better way to have a framework to understand our condition. I think this is just my my take. I mean, it's just an argument, right? Because Afro-pessimism is just a framework to have rather than an ideology, a way of looking at things, rather than a guiding light on how to organize self and society. But continuing here, But we must turn to Patterson to understand the meaning of murder when it comes to Charles Robbins and the black woman in the desert. The slave dies, it is true, but he dies in the master. This passing does not mark the death of a relational subject, but the expiration of an implement, a speaking implement with no auditor for the sound it makes. What is remarkable about Charles Robinson's interrogation is that, unlike Nancy Jane Smith, Robbins is given no opportunity to have his idea recognized and incorporated by his interlocutors, not at the level of filiation or at the level of affiliation. In the libidinal economy of the human versus slave antagonism, he cannot be imagined as someone's son or father or brother, and nor can he be imagined as someone who speaks a philosophical language, the politics of which would either concur or conflict with members of the tribunal. He has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. Like objects in a grammatical structure, Charles Robbins and the black woman murdered in the desert are objects upon which the subject of a sentence acts, and the stability of the human race depends on these roles never being altered or reversed. Okay? Continuing here, part 4. In Copenhagen, the publisher of a small left-wing press had asked me to give a public lecture at his press's launch of an anthology featuring the work of Jared Sexton, Saida Hartman, Frantz Fanon, and me. I said yes, but I had one request. I wanted to meet with a group of black organizers with no one else in the room in order to facilitate a 3-hour workshop on Afro-pessimism that would be similar to workshops I had facilitated in North America, South Africa, and other parts of Europe. Denmark is a very white place, he said in a Skype conversation. Though he knew of multiracial organizations doing political work in Denmark, finding one that was exclusively black would be a challenge. A week later, he came back with the name, a relatively new group called Marange, a people of color organization. The kind of group I had asked for didn't exist. But since Marange came into existence to counter Denmark's self-aggrandizing celebrations commemorating the 100th anniversary of its abolishment of colonialism, when in 1917 it sold the Virgin Islands to the U.S., which also allowed it to shed the taint of its past as a slave-dependent economy, it made sense for me to conduct a workshop for people who are interested in the political ramifications of the longue durée of slavery. I did not know that the Virgin Islands were owned by Denmark. That's some new history right there. You learn something new every day. Crack them books open. I arrived in Copenhagen steadfast in my conviction that even the most persecuted white women are a priori positioned as masters in relation to black people, even to black men. This assertion gains greater clarity when we consider that at the level of consciousness, what psychoanalysis calls pre-conscious interest, the realm of the psyche that can be brought to consciousness and spoken, it would appear as though Nancy Jane Smith, Charles Robbins, and the unnamed black woman in the desert are all the same species. They are all Marxist revolutionaries who would argue that they are of the same species, the working class. But what becomes clear as one compares their interrogations is that though they share the same consciousness, and though they would say they are of the same species, working class humans, in point of fact, the unconscious realm of the psyche has no capacity to recognize Charles Robbins and the unnamed black woman in the desert as human beings. They cannot be incorporated into familial or filial imaginaries of family or political relations, regardless of the preconscious/conscious mind's protestations to the contrary. In short, the conscious mind of a radical says, I don't see color, whereas the unconscious mind is saying, in ways that are rarely legible, I live in fear of a black planet. This duality is sustained by the fact that the violence that positions Nancy Jane Smith as a white woman and as a human being is structurally different than the violence that positions Charles Robbins and the unnamed black woman in the desert as blacks and slaves. This flies in the face of theoretical and political assumptions that non-black intellectuals and activists hold dear about violence and gender. This challenge, this argument presents, is not intellectual, but rather it is emotional, especially when it comes from a cisgendered black man who critiques the paradigm of white femininity in less than dulcet tones. But white women as human beings are structurally more powerful than black people because they, white women, are members of the human species, whereas blacks are the sentient beings against which humanity is defined. Even in the horrible act of rape of white women by a black man, for example, the structure of the relation does not change. This is an incendiary assertion, but no theory worth its salt should shy away from pyrotechnics. To begin with, Afro-pessimism in no way condones or seeks to explain away sexual violence. On the contrary, violence as structure or paradigm and sexual violence as an ensemble of practice within that paradigm is at the heart of Afro-pessimist meditations, albeit in ways that run counter to received wisdom. If he goes down the Eldridge Cleaver route, basically saying like, if for anybody who's read Soul on Ice, Eldridge was saying like, yeah, I was a rapist for white women because I thought it was a type of revolutionary action. If he goes down the Eldridge Cleaver route, it's going to be very disappointing. That this very funny book turned very dark very quickly. Let's see. All right. In the centuries when slavery was still on the books and not strangely sublimated by euphemisms like citizen and universal suffrage, a male slave forcing a female slave owner into sex against her will was as morally wrong as a male slave master forcing a female slave into sex against her will. Sex as a weapon is revolting and cannot be condoned. Despite all the moral injunctions against such acts, to suggest that the male slave's rape of his female master is also a problem of ethics is to mistake force, the musculature of the black male rapist, for power, the web of institutional capacity that makes him an extension of her prerogative and power, even in the act of rape. At the level of performance, she is his victim. At the level of paradigm, he is still her tool. What does one do with that? One does not look for answers that solve the problem of performance while ignoring the problem of paradigm. One sits with it. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, that's like, if your dog bites you, right? Your dog bites you. It's not a good thing, right? And nobody would say like your dog is okay to bite you, even if you like hit your dog before, right? But in that situation, humans, the system, are still more powerful than dogs. Because even if your dog bites you, even if your dog tries to kill you, right, humans will still eventually win in the end because your dog will be put to sleep. There's no way that that dog will just get away with murdering a person and humans will not kill it. The same way, if a slave, hypothetically back in the day, raped the master, right, it wouldn't. In that situation, yes, she is the victim, but she is still the one in more power, still more powerful, right? And in that situation, that slave will probably definitely be put to death. Though there is a very interesting book that I have here talking about relations between black men and white women during slavery. And I've been waiting to read that. I might read that after this because I just want to blow through some books before the end of the year. We're trying to hit 10 before it's all said and done. Let's continue here. So no Marxist revolutionary would say that shorter working hours and higher wages for workers redress the unethical paradigm of capitalism. But when many people encounter the black, a sentient being who, unlike the worker, does not have a problem, but rather a Du Bois has written, is a problem, the image burns too intensely for the eyes. But even as the risk of searing our retinas, we will gaze unflinchingly at this flame. Even the women in the room where the Copenhagen workshop took place were not, for the most part, white women. Many of them were not black women either. And they knew enough from my introduction that the white woman is Peter Watkins' Punishment Park. A radical left-wing prisoner named Nancy Jane Smith was a stand-in for any non-black woman. I plan to return to this thorny proposition that the status of non-black women vis-a-vis black men hasn't changed over time. And a quote from an article by Jared Sexton where he writes, "It seems counterintuitive, but because of her historical implication in the structures of white supremacy, marked by her limited capacity to marshal state violence or state-sanctioned paramilitary violence, the white woman can have the black man or black woman brutalized for transgressions, real or imagined. However, and because of this relation of power, she can also rape him, thereby reversing the polarity of a rape fantasy pervasive in the anti-black world. Regardless of his size and strength, his prowess and his pride, he is structurally vulnerable to her." Contrary to many standard legal definitions, she is able to rape him without his necessarily being physically penetrated against his will. In this sense, the fear of rape and the fear of penetration must be carefully distinguished. Perhaps rape is better understood not as an isolated act, but as part of a spectrum of sexual coercion generated within a broader set of social, political, and economic relations regulated, but not simply controlled by the racial states and enabling permutations of enactment. During my evening lecture to 140 audience members, which followed the 3-hour workshop with 30 Danish radical activists, I distributed handouts with Sexton's quote on it to the people who came after the workshop so that they could read it when I came to it in my speech, and so that they would have it in front of them if they wanted to discuss it during the Q&A. The reception of these ideas was thoughtful and engaged in both the workshop and the talk that followed, which meant my guard was down when I got to Berlin to discuss these ideas with left-wing academics who presumably had more theoretical chops than the activists in Copenhagen. Most of the people who attended the Morange workshop had read very little about Afro-pessimism. They were hard-scrabble organizers, many of whom had seen Denmark's state violence up close. This made them open to a deeper theorization of that violence, even if what they learned might shatter their previously held ideas about the structure, not simply the performance of that violence. I was impressed by their willingness to sit for 3 hours in discussions and exercises that challenged so much of their received wisdom and, more to the point, so much of the foundation upon which their organizing was based. The workshop and the speech I gave that followed took place in Folkets Hus. These were two really special events for the 30 people in the workshop and the people who came to my public lecture, because the building, Folkets Hus, the People's House, had been the hub of radical activism and community struggles for decades. Arts and crafts, as well as rebellion and resistance to the Copenhagen police, had emanated from Folkets Hus in the past. The police had closed it down for about 2 years. My workshops and speech were the first events of its reopening. People were excited and also a bit on edge, wondering if the cops would raid it, as they had in the past, and haul all 100 plus people to jail. An Asian Danish woman asked me if the violence of white supremacy and capitalism, patriarchal violence, is what I, as an Asian woman, suffer, and if you're suggesting white supremacy and anti-Blackness are not the same. In fact, I hear you saying the people who suffer white supremacy are also the people who, along with whites, perpetrate anti-Blackness. Then my question is, what does that mean? What does that do? Maybe what I want to say is, how do we forge solidarity and multiracial coalitions such as Morange? I'd be asked the same question in 2 days' time in Berlin, but the tone and intent would be hostile. And I would say, I don't give a rat's ass about solidarity, which wasn't true. But the way I cared about solidarity wasn't the way the mob that had packed its bags to meet me in Berlin cared about it. What we're doing in this workshop is a form of solidarity, I replied. The important things we need to understand are the ways non-Black people of color can crowd out discussions of a Black grammar of suffering by insisting that the coalition needs to focus on what we all have in common. It is true that we all suffer from police aggression, that we all suffer from capitalist domination, but we should use the space opened up by political organizing, which is geared towards reformist objectives, like stopping police brutality and ending racist immigration policies, as an opportunity to explore problems for which there are no coherent solutions. Anti-Black violence is a paradigm of oppression for which there is no coherent form of redress other than Frantz Fanon's The End of the World. Solidarity means not crowding out discussions of Black social death just because there is no coherent form of redress on horizon. I think that's what we've done today. Your participation in this workshop with the Black people in Morange is an act of solidarity. That's the thing, right? Because like for every other struggle, class struggle, there is an end goal in mind that we can imagine. We want to end class struggle by having the working class owning the means of production, having them have control over the fates of the companies they work at and the institutions they support. When it comes to sexism and the fight against patriarchy, there is a sort of end goal that we can imagine where men are not so domineering and controlling over women, and that women have the equal opportunity to control their own bodies, autonomy, and have the capacity to live as they want without the fear of violence from not only men, but women as well. When we think about gay liberation, there is a time that we can imagine where people are allowed to live freely and openly as people having an orientation and sexuality that is different from the norm. When it comes about gender freedom, there's an idea that we can imagine of people being able to identify with their genders as they want. But when we talk about fighting anti-Blackness, there is no full way to reach that plateau or that promised land other than the end of the world as we know it, which is terrifying for people to imagine. As you know, as people say, I forgot, I think it was Zizek who said this, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I would argue against that. We can imagine a world past capitalism. I can imagine it right now, right? But it's hard as hell to imagine a world without anti-Blackness. That's an argument that Frank is making. It's hard to imagine a world that still would not have remnants of the old regime if we were to wipe everything clean today. You get what I'm saying? And I think what he's trying to say here is that even though we organize as leftists, as radicals, to talk about these very deep issues and strategize on ways to make it to that promised land and make a better world, we still open up space for the things that we still have no answers for, such as the fact that Black people are naturally socially dead, and that anti-Blackness is endemic in a lot of cultures and societies, and it cannot be just easily rooted out. It will not end with just more mixed people and that sort of stuff, because Blackness is not central. Blackness is not real. Neither is whiteness is real. So even if somebody were to be mixed, even if the whole world was mixed, there would still be, if we keep white supremacy in play, there would still be people who would say we can classify different people based on race. And we don't know how it works. We can't even imagine how it would work, but we know that it would still work. You get what I'm saying? Blackness is not central to people's identity. Blackness is not real, neither is whiteness. So that would not help either way either. We have to imagine something so much bigger and grander, and it's scary to imagine that. But the end of the world is the only way, as Frank would say. Continuing here. All right, there is no point for point Pilgrim's Progress that can explain how the clips from Punishment Park made the Copenhagen workshop a success, or why the same analysis went south when I got to Berlin. Berlin was as hot as it had been 2 days earlier in Copenhagen, but the greater density of buildings there, the teeming throngs of tourists, and the fact that, unlike Copenhagen, Berlin is not bordered on 3 sides by the sea make it bake even more. The rooms used for the conference on May 1968 didn't smell like the Volkshuis room in Nuremberg, the African, Arab, and white working class neighborhood of Copenhagen where Volkshuis is located. That was the first thing I noticed. There was no smell. It was a clean room of sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows that trapped cold, odorless air inside. The pentagon of white formica tables on wall-to-wall carpets was a far cry from the unvarnished tables at Volkshuis in Copenhagen, most of which had to be hauled from a storage room and were clearly donated over the years because they didn't fit together the way the tables fit together in Berlin. In Nuremberg, we all chipped in, hauling tables, unstacking chairs, working with the whiteboard that had been donated for the workshop by Kaplevej 44, another Nuremberg community center run by a cheerful and direct woman named Lisbeth Brill. A whiteboard where we propped on a chair and which had to be held up with one hand to keep it from sliding down as I wrote on it. Ladders and empty coat racks dotted the room at Volkshuis, and the floor was a palimpsest of scuff marks from metal chairs or the rubber soles of SWAT teams. Volkshuis smelled lived in, contested, a room which weed and tear gas had each called home. It smelled of dry sweat and laughter, and fuck the police, and the windows had broad sills where comrades who came late sat. In contrast to the People's Hut People's House in Copenhagen, the conference room in Berlin was on the fourth floor of an office building with cameras embedded in keypads at the entrance of each of the floors. You had to wait for someone inside the panopticon to recognize your face in the lens of the door and buzz you in. The well-pressed staff replenished white bone chinaware and coffee, tea, and cakes twice a day. Compared to the Danish activists in Copenhagen, who I thought would be most dismissive of Afro-pessimism, the gathering of academics in Berlin was a sad milquetoast menagerie. For the most part, dust-ups between academics seemed to matter not one bit to people on the ground. All too often, academics ascribe more gravitas to the stakes of their debates than is warranted. The dust-up over and around Afro-pessimism is different, however. It is different not because of its importance to people within the academy. On the contrary, it is different because of the way it has captured the imagination of Black people around the world. In Afro-pessimism, the imaginations of Black people on the ground and the intellectual labors of Black people in revolts have finally found an unflinching resonance in an ensemble of interventions being produced by Black intellectuals. One would think that the left-leaning intellectuals would find reasons to rejoice in this. Afro-pessimism is not an ensemble of theoretical interventions that leads the struggle for Black liberation. One should think of it as a theory that is legitimate because it has secured a mandate from Black people at their best, which is to say, a mandate to speak the analysis and rage that most Black people are free only to whisper. For some bonehead reason, I thought these white academics in Berlin and their Asian junior partner, wherever you find white people, you always find Asian people just in tow, lockstep. Why? We know why. Anyway. For some bonehead reason, I thought these white academics in Berlin and their Asian junior partner would coalesce as a safe gathering to share what, under normal circumstances, should not be shared. The hint of sanctuary was in the invitation that Professor Ian Bryce and Helmut Jahn sent me. At every turn, we will resist circumscribing the conference's subjects in terms of date and place, i.e. May 1968, Paris 1968. Read the letter of invitation. It went on to suggest that the purpose of the conference was to challenge encrusted narratives by reflecting on how the 50-year gestation of 1968 has allowed us to consider the period's new racial, sexual, and practical coalitions, both aesthetic and political, with new eyes. At every turn, maybe I turned too hard. Maybe I believed that if any group of people were trained in the theory needed to discuss and debate Afro-pessimism's first principles as a means of assessing 1968 with fresh eyes, that group was more likely to be the pedigreed Marxist scholars at the conference in Berlin than activists much younger and less pedigreed in Copenhagen. Professor Ian Bryce was strong and stocky and not too tall. During the conference breaks, he picked his way between pulling guard on an end-around sweep. But I didn't think Ian would lead the charge in Berlin. Indeed, I thought just the opposite, given the fact that in one of his emails to me, and then again in person, he said how much my critique of Antonio Gramsci's assumptive logic had aided him in writing his monograph on Pasolini. After the conference, I realized that he was no different from most white academics who dabble in Afro-pessimism for their own ends without regard for the fact that they are holding a grenade that has no pins. Afro-pessimism is a looter's creed, critique without redemption on a vision of redress except the end of the world. In the hands of a Marxist academic, it tends to be corrupted and contorted into something with no purchase for Black revolt. In hands such as these, hands that craft visions of antagonisms and dust-ups between the workers and the capitalists, and have no clear understanding that the essential antagonism is the antagonism between Blacks in the world, two birds are killed with one stone. The centrality of Black people's social death, the grammar of suffering of the slave, is dispensed with or given short shrift. And secondly, the imagination of the slave, which often dreams of the world's undoing without being burdened by a vision of a new world, such as socialism or a liberated nation state, is made to fit within the limits of what non-Black people have the stomach for. James Baldwin said it best in his essay, "The Black boy looks at the white boy Norman Mailer." where he wrote about the terrible gap between Norman Mailer's life and my own. It is a painful essay in which he explains how he experienced through the beginning and ending of his friendship with Mailer those moments when blackness inspires white dreams of liberation, and how it felt he suddenly realized the impossibility of the inverse. The really ghastly thing about trying to convey to a white man the reality of the Negro experience has nothing whatever to do with the fact of color, but has to do with this man's relationship to his own life. He will face in your life only what he is willing to face in his. Shout out to James Baldwin, one of our heroes. Fabulous writer, fabulous darling. His long Paris nights with Mailer bore fruit only to the extent that Mailer was able to say, "Me too." Beyond that was the void that Baldwin carried with him into and subsequently out of the friendship. I'm afraid that most of the white people I have ever known impressed me as being in the grip of a weird nostalgia, dreaming of a vanished state of security and order against which dream unfailingly and unconsciously they tested and very often lost their lives. He is writing about the encounters between blacks and whites in Paris and New York in the 1950s, but he may as well be writing about Ian and the posse that came for me at the Berlin Conference on May 1968. In short, there was blood on the floor and most of it was mine. But I could not imagine that when Ian Bryce called my name. Happily, I screened the two clips from Punishment Park. The light came on, and in my lecture, I proffered the critique of the film that had been well received in the Copenhagen workshop, how and why the putative political solidarity between Nancy Jane Smith and Charles Robbins did not mitigate the structural antagonisms that they embodied, how the film's unconscious dramatized this antagonism while disavowing it at the level of its conscious narrative intent. I concluded by saying that rather than advance the project of revolution, both politically and aesthetically, the white radical revolts of the late 1960s and early 70s, as well as well-intended films such as Punishment Park, when perceived through the slave's eyes, Charles Robbins and the Black Woman in the Desert, did more to fortify and extend the interlocutory life of Western civil society than to hasten its overthrow. I was stunned by the magnitude of the applause. More than once, I was told how elegant and sophisticated my talk had been. Sandra Dove, a British art historian, even used the word beautiful in reflecting upon the elan of the prose. But the emotional resonance of those words was familiar. It's what Black women and some men experience when our hair is touched by a white person who doesn't ask permission, but assumes that because this violation came with a compliment, it's so soft, you should, like a Lhasa Apso being petted, be grateful for their attention. It's what it means to be told, "You're so well spoken." You can make them swoon, but it doesn't mean they're hearing what you say. It means they experience something else to orgasm in the way you say what you say. Soul music. Blowback occurs. However, as the lyrics to the song start to sink in, you can set your watch to the next 3 moments. Guilt, resentment, aggression. Yeah. In Berlin, the clock struck resentment and aggression. The assembled professors skipped the hour of guilt. Guilt is a dirty word in German. He should have knew that this was going to happen. Come on now. It was then that Negrophobia kicked in a manner that was, to say the least, uncanny in the sense that for the next 20 minutes, we reenacted the same dynamics that characterized the interrogation of Charles Robbins by the Punishment Park Tribunal. To be sure, the content of the questions the room fired at me were more diverse than a bowl of Fruit Loops, but they shared a common effect of hostility and patronizing condescension. On one level, the scene was more, for lack of a better word, civilized than the tribunal. I was not handcuffed and chained to a chair, and the 10 members of the conference had no prosecutorial power over me. But one could argue that the professorial code of civility made the interrogation more bizarre than what Charles Robbins endured. In short order, the group's capacity for logic and debate disintegrated into righteous indignation at the way, as they saw it, I played fast and loose with the film, at my lack of appreciation for the bonds of love that had been forged in the 1960s between people like Charles Robbins and Nancy Jane Smith, and finally indignation at my claim that non-Black people of color, white civil society's junior partners, have something to salvage, whereas Blacks have nothing to lose. That Asians and blacks are structural antagonists, even when they are joined together in coalition fighting for civil and human rights. That's hilarious. But that's just the baseline point of view that a lot of white leftists have. Come on now. It's like, oh, all you non-white people, all of you are just fighting for your freedom and fighting against white supremacy and racism. But no, 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 no. It's not the same fight. 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 What is the inherent difference? What is the inherent difference? What is the inherent difference? Most non-white people are fighting for acceptance into the realm of white supremacy. Most non-white people are fighting for acceptance into the realm of white supremacy. Most non-white people are fighting basically for the compliment to be called white. Meanwhile, black people racialized as black in this white supremacist world, are fighting for the end of the world. Fighting for the end of the world. We're fighting for the end of the world as we know it. All right, part 7. Professor Li Ling Chen took issue with Asians being cast as the junior partners of white civil society. She did not take issue, however, in the form of an engagement with and/or critique of my analysis. She simply said how mad it all made her, as though the important thing to consider was how non-blacks felt when critiqued rather than the material impacts on black lives that necessitated the critiques to begin with. Mobs might ask you if you really raped that woman or robbed that man as they string you up, but rarely do they quiet down and wait for an answer. I felt like I've been cast as the facilitator of a group therapy session, and I had asked the wrong question or the right question, which sparked a chain reaction. I had, however, both unleashed this chain reaction and become the repository of its smoldering transference. Ian Bryce led the charge. The way his chin thrust out when he spoke, and the small involuntary cannonballs of breath that burst between his words bore a resemblance to Reg in Seattle as he steered young Luke to the parking lot, a man I had seldom conjured in more than 50 years. Bryce began with an obliquely... By the way, for people that don't remember that part, basically, when he was a kid in Seattle, he had never been around that many young black boys. And Reg was a black guy who got kicked out of the rec center he used to go to. And Luke was the white guy who was the boss of the rec center. And basically, Reg was about to stab Luke. And he's saying Luke was kind of like, had this like redness about his face. And this white academic years later, as he's giving this speech about this movie, resembles that, young white boy he saw in that parking lot who was about to get poked up. All right, anyway. Bryce began with an obliquely motivated form of chastisement. He complained that throughout my entire presentation, he had heard the name Peter Watkins only once. He accused me of mounting an unsophisticated reading of the film, of not respecting the film as a cultural object. He accused me of casting the film itself as a transparent reflection of what happened in the segments of scenes during which Charles Robbins was interrogated. He wanted more thick description of the film, more exegesis on it as a work of art, in keeping, no doubt, with the other presentations at the conference. I told him that my points of attention lay elsewhere. I could have added, had you been paying attention, you would have heard how I touched upon the cinematic strategies of the film, which make the very case you say is too reductive, that the film does in fact labor in ways that accompany rather than critique the anti-black racism Robbins endured in the tribunal. And furthermore, it doesn't matter that the director thinks he's doing something different. What matters is how the film labors. But I didn't say this because I naively expected Bryce to respond by saying to me, okay, so tell me about your points of attention. Sorry to harp on about what you did not do, but let's use the little time we have productively by discussing your presentation on its own terms. That would have made too much sense. He had built up a head of steam, or more accurately, short little choo-choo train puffs of exasperation. He was the little engine that could, huffing and puffing up the hill, pulling the others up the track behind him. As Ian Bryce cloaked his exasperation about my lack of devotion to the film as a cultural object, another professor, Arthur Winter, cloaked his exasperation in a similar Jesuit-like devotion to the history of the film as a cultural object. The context in 1971 of Punishment Park's production and distribution. Don't you realize? A prosaic translation of his remarks would read, Peter Watkins was a white man who was in solidarity with people like Charles Robbins. Don't you realize that in the making and exhibition of this film, he suffered for black people? In other words, Winter took it upon himself to school me, to tell me what I already knew and knew well, with the kind of restrained incredulity one employs when little Johnny spills his milk on the floor for the third time. Damn it. Arthur Winter took pains to explain to me that Punishment Park and Peter Watkins were viciously attacked in the press and on college campuses when the film was screened there for dramatizing a paranoid vision of America and for being a foreigner who hates America. The tribunal was enraged with Robbins because America had preferred to a helping hand to blacks, albeit discreetly, and his violent insurgency smacked of ingratitude. Professor Winter was saying the same to me, with Watkins a stand-in for the state. One cannot be black, Frantz Fanon once warned, without impunity. One cannot be black with impunity. One cannot be black with impunity. Basically, you cannot be black without being punished. That's what Frantz Fanon was trying to say. You cannot be black and go unpunished in life. I gotta read some Fanon, man. I've been delaying that for the last 18 years of my life. Since I heard about The Wretched of the Earth, I should have read that book when I was 17. Should have read that book when I was 17. I have a long list to catch up on. Because Fanon has been on the back burner for at least the past 2 decades of my life. Anyway, continuing here. No theaters would show the film, Winter protested, and it was pulled in less than a week from the one obscure theater where it was screened. His eyes sent out distress signals. A flurry of hands waved to be recognized by Ian Bryce. Winter's voice seemed to crack, as though I had besmirched not a filmmaker whom he had never met, but a close and revered relation. This is family, his tone betrayed. He ignored people whose hands were raised. He rushed on before Ian Bryce gave someone else the floor. When Watkins brought it to college campuses, he was attacked by professors in the audience. Winter gave a pitch for the angels. His eyes began to mist. I was sure he would end with a motion to put Watkins' name forward for sainthood or friend of the Negro. Winter's commentary sputtered to an end as he reminded me that the end of the scene with Charles Robbins being bound and gagged in the tent of the tribunal, was a cinematic quotation of the Chicago 8 trial in which Bobby Seale was bound and gagged. His point being, in case I didn't get it, that the cinematic quotation, coupled with the hell Peter Watkins caught when he went on tour with the film, and with the way the film was panned by the critics, is exemplary of how the film was in solidarity with my project and with the plight of Charles Robbins and the unnamed black women who was riddled with bullets in Punishment Park. Basically, what they're trying to say is like, don't you see? This white man gave up everything for the Negro. And you're here lambasting his movie. How dare you? How dare you? How dare you? How dare you do this? This good white man gave up everything for you, and you're over here making fun of his movie. Oh, shit. This is great. This is great. All right. And what does Frank Wilderson say? Frank says, I laughed. I laughed, for I had no wish to insult Winter by taking him seriously. But he wasn't joking. He was as pumped up and as serious as Ian Bryce had been when he chastised me for doing an end run around the aesthetic integrity of Punishment Park. From the far side of the room, Bryce and Winter's professorial twaddle was modestly baptized by Professor Helmut John, who nodded and grumbled into his neck, I too worried about the place of history in your presentation. The floodgates widened. More voices poured in. Sometimes people spoke over each other, as though they had arrived so late to the lynching that they needed to push against the spines of others to get a closer look, or a better stab, after not quite human hanging in the tree. It was what my students would call a total mindfuck, in the sense that this scenario of charged effect in service to the most hysterical display of Negro phobogenesis was first projected onto the screen in the conference room in the form of Charles Robinson's clip from Punishment Park, and then reenacted in the room by people at the conference. In other words, the tribunal interrogation of Charles Robbins involved nothing on the order of a dispute between communist and capitalist ideas, nor was it, as in the interrogation of Nancy Jane Smith, a dispute between two divergent views about moral hygiene. Charles Robbins had been structurally barred from the dynamic of reciprocity. This structural injunction was what characterized the conference, and this characterization is exemplary of what happens to Black voices when those voices make arguments that are predicated on a theory of violence that A, does not apply to all suffering people, and B, suggests that even people who suffer from the scourge of white supremacy, capitalism, and gender oppression are simultaneously agents and beneficiaries of anti-Black violence. Such arguments blow the lid off the unconscious as evinced by the fact that they stir a communal wrath of half sentences, strong moods, and wagons beginning to circle. This is what Sebastian, a Canadian graduate student who had introduced himself to me outside as Imbis the night before, meant when he described the room's meltdown and its aggressivity as what Fanon might have called a tear in the psychic infrastructure of the conference on 1968, which is to say that the work of the Afro-Pessimism was accomplished, if only for a moment, in that Berlin conference room. A German word that means a small food stand or street food shop, and that's what Imbiss means. Okay. The uncanny kicked in again. I experienced the same sensation that I experienced the first time I saw the scene of the unnamed Black woman face down in the desert of Punishment Park, when several LA County sheriffs riddled her back with bullets. The conference room's cacophony of raw expression mimicked the dry pop of gunshots, and the voice snarling, "Get the bitch," as the hot and thirsty cops stood on a ridge above her and spent all their ammo. To my dismay, this effect was not just as intense when two of the women, a white woman, Professor Sandra Dove, and the Asian woman, Professor Li Ling Chen, spoke. In some respects, there was an odd honesty to how those two women spoke. My presentation was underwritten by the claim that everyone in the room was a structural antagonist to me, to Charles Robbins, and to the unnamed Black woman who was killed in Punishment Park. Everyone else had given a presentation that was underwritten by the assumptive logic that the structural antagonism was between workers or of whatever race, gender, or nationality, and the capitalists of the world. Confrontation with the lecture, mine, and argued that confrontation with the lecture, mine, that argued that exploitation and alienation, the generative mechanism of the antagonism between the proletariat and the capitalists, was a mere conflict, a struggle occasioned and allowed by the essential antagonism between Blacks, slaves, and humans, masters, made the professors in Berlin suffer from what Jared Sexton has called the anxiety of antagonism. The white men, Ian Bryce, Arthur Winter, and Helmut Jahn, had responded symptomatically, speaking away from the source of their trauma, knitting their brows as they conjured red herrings about my ahistoricism and my display of bad faith with respect to Yauman efforts on the part of Peter Watkins and the bleeding heart of his film. The honesty of Sandra Dove and Li Ling Chen manifested itself in the fact that they actually had something to say about my presentation. Unlike the white men who had something to say about what I didn't say. This is not to cathedralize the wisdom of Dove and Chen. Sandra Dove and Li Ling Chen were saddened and angered, respectively, by my presentation. The honesty of their interventions, meaning their scattered sound bites, manifested itself in the fact that they responded to what I had said. The perverted nature of their honesty was due to the fact that their responses did not manifest in an actual engagement of my argument, but instead foregrounded the way my lecture made them feel. Sandra Dove felt hurt and disappointed, perhaps betrayed. Li Ling Chen was angry at her wits' end. Li Ling and I had met at academic gatherings several times in the past. So on one day in Berlin, we had embraced and sat beside each other at the table. I had offered her coffee cough drops and nodded in that amen corner sort of way whenever she skewered a Deleuzian intervention by two prior speakers, whose arguments were theoretical accompaniments to neoliberal individualism rather than a blast of social iconoclasm that Deleuze and his spiritual progenitors anointed themselves as having. We were soulmates on the rampage and might still have remained so had I not taken the critique of neoliberalism over a line she was not prepared to cross. And on one day as well, and on day one as well, Sandra Dove had winked at me from where she sat at the other end of the table. The universal wink of friendship between the races. Okay. Never heard of that. Or perhaps I'm mistaken and there was simply a mote in her eye. Okay. And I never cherry with my charms, flashed my 52 teeth, and I never cherry with my charms, flashed my 52 teeth. I returned from a bathroom break to find her at the seat next to mine. She introduced herself and asked if it was all right to sit beside me. The sun was beating on her back where she had been sitting, she explained. I was sandwiched snugly between Dove and Chen, and this had given me comfort, for surely Dove and Chen would be alive to what I had to say. I thought Sandra Dove and I were in a groove. There's nothing more deadly than a Negro self-delusion that makes one forget that there can be no love without hatred, guilt, resentment, aggressivity. The clock ticked on. The force of their honesty was of a piece. The force of their honesty was of a piece with the angry avoidance of the white men. In other words, Dove and Chen spoke to the presentation itself, foregrounding how hurt and angry they were by it, while simultaneously fortifying and extending their lynching effect that preceded them when the white men spoke. Their words were different than the words of the white men, but the effect was of peace. And in this way, they mapped a cultural formation across gender and race, structured by a shared anti-Blackness and, most importantly, subtended by their communal capacity for violence. The community had been wronged. Now it was time to get some justice. Instead of working through and then against my argument and the archive of critical literature that scaffolded it, something she was quite capable of and had done so well in her skewering of the fall politics of Deleuze and in her own presentation and critique of Winnicott's theory by way of Lacan. Li-Ling Chen sidestepped the archive of Afro-Pessimism as well as my lecture's thesis. In other words, rather than debate the thesis she found to be so objectionable, she simply pronounced her objection. Afro-Pessimism is absolute and totalizing. And she then proceeded to foreground the way it made her feel. I am so angry. It makes me angry. I don't want to say anything because I'll get angry at Frank if I have to speak. And we're friends. She must have seen my eyebrow arch. Oh, Frank. She must have seen my eyebrow arch when she said friends because she blurted the same sentence out again. I don't want to say anything because I'll get angry at Frank if I have to speak, and modified the ending with, and we're colleagues, before extolling for the third time. And I'm tired and I'm hungry and I want to go to lunch. Not everyone in the room was stricken with multiple anxiety disorders, however, but of the 6 out of 10 people who spoke, Professor Tilson McMahon was the only one who wasn't. Tilson McMahon actually tried to reason with Chen. Indeed, he tried to reason with the entire room. He said that my critique mattered because my argument was cogent and had to be attended to. McMahon noted that the resonances between my presentation and Li-Ling Chen's presentation, in which Chen, demonstrated how left cultural politics of 1968 created an opportunity for the right to emerge as both a defender of tradition and as a pseudo-populist force. I think what Frank could have included, and by the way, I didn't see the full presentation. I just got a description. But I'll just say this, I think it would be good to put in there people's natural reactions to hearing about Afro-pessimism. Because when people hear about it, as Black men, we sort of anticipate all the actions that non-Black people will have to us saying anything, us existing and us just talking naturally just makes white people say this. Y'all stop complaining about slavery. And it's like, bro, we were talking about the NBA. Hey, Jim Crow was a long time ago. Bro, we are talking about Jay-Z versus Nas. What the fuck are y'all talking about? Like, you have to include, preface here, because we know all the psychosis, we know all the things that tick in white people's minds because they don't understand us. Their just natural inclination is to say, "Oh, well, I don't see color. Racism was a long time ago. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. There's no racism here, brother. I don't see color. I don't see color. Islam forbids color. All this stuff." Like, white people and non-black people are schizophrenic in the minds, so we have to be aware of all of that and preface everything that we say with their natural inclinations. You just have to run through the checklist. So what I would have done after the Afro-pessimism presentation, I would have said it's natural after hearing about Afro-pessimism to feel angry. It's natural after Afro-pessimism to feel like you are being attacked for being white or non-black, or feel like it is a helpless situation. And most people don't like feeling helpless, even if it's about something that has nothing to do with them, right? It's natural to feel these things. Put that in there so that you can get a better response. Because the way they're acting, they feel like this is natural, as if it wasn't expected. I don't even have to be in the room. I just have to know that there is a black man standing up in a room talking about racism with non-black people present. I know for a fact he is about to be in for a shit show, even if the people are the leftist, brightest intellectuals, the intelligentsia of the world, of the left. I know he is in for a shit show, okay? So he just needs to be prepared for that. And I think it would be good to have the trigger warnings afterwards and the decompression parts afterwards. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, so not everyone in the room was stricken with multiple anxiety disorders, however, but of the 6 out of 10 people who spoke, Professor Tilson McMahon was the only one who wasn't. Tilson McMahon actually tried to reason with Chen. Indeed, he tried to reason with the entire room. He said that my critique mattered because my argument was cogent and had to be attended to. McMahon noted the resonance between my presentation and Li Ling Chen's presentation, in which Chen demonstrated how left cultural politics of 1968 created an opportunity for the right to emerge as both a defender of tradition and as a pseudo-populist force. It was clear that McMahon was not saying that Li Ling Chen and Frank Wilderson were on the same page politically, or that our archives had anything in common. What he was saying was that if Chen and the rest of the room could tamp down the rage, we could have a decent conversation and debate about the two presentations that were similar to each other. And unlike most of what had preceded, how Chen's and Wilderson's talks were similar by virtue of the fact that they opened up a way for us to discuss overarching political and paradigmatic forces that affected the activism and aesthetics of 1968 and which continues today. McMahon was saying, isn't it wonderful that you both share this penchant for analysis of larger political forces? And Li Cheng retaliated, my work is nothing like Frank's. I don't go around the world saying Chinese women are the most oppressed people on the planet. Presumably the way Wilderson goes around the world saying black people are the most oppressed people on the planet. This is insane. Professor McMahon was astonished and dismayed. He tried to reason with her again, but she repeated how angry it was going to make her if she had to talk about this and how much she wanted to go to lunch. McMahon, no doubt, had not counted on the force of his unconscious manifesting itself with such tenacious fixation in her conscious speech. But the unconscious is a faith-based initiative where reason has no purchase. Had there been 10 Tilson McMahons in the room instead of the 10 who were there, we might have had robust engagement, which is not to say he is an Afro-pessimist, nor is it to say that I would require that. On the 140 people in Focus Hus in Copenhagen and the 30 people in the workshop that preceded my speech, I would not presume that more than a handful actually agreed with me or with Afro-pessimism. But it didn't matter. Agreement was not my prerequisite. Honest engagement was. But the resonance between the FBI's document on Black identity extremism and the psychic infrastructure of Chen's objections to what she views as my brand of oppression Olympics is stronger than the resonance between her political analysis and mine. Finally, Sandra Dove spoke. She was unwavering in her belief that Black men are not structurally vulnerable to white women. She believed that all women are structurally vulnerable to all men, as though female slave masters were disempowered in the face of their male slaves, or as though the paradigm of slavery is a thing of the past unreplicated in the present. Sandra Dove had been betrayed, and for several minutes she oscillated between lashing the whip and displaying her stigmata. Earlier, during the screening of the Nancy Jane Smith segment, I sensed from the way that Sandra Dove's laughter championed the feminist salvos Nancy Jane Smith hurled back at her sexually uptight interrogators that Dove might have difficulty with the way I critiqued both Nancy Jane Smith and the tribunal, with the way I characterized their display of hatred for one another as little family feuds that would end by strengthening the bonds between them, even if they killed Nancy Jane Smith. Perhaps this is why my analysis seems to have hurt Sandra Dove so deeply. By the way of Nancy Jane Smith, Sandra Dove was not only being critiqued, but in some respects ridiculed for the puniness of the demand that emanates from white female suffering in the face of white male patriarchy. The force of Sandra Dove's objection was as palpable as those of Li Ling Chen and the white men, and it came with the same sensation of victimization at the hands of a black man. Perhaps she saw herself in coalition with the Black Panthers, and she felt my presentation made a mockery of such desire. She was right, of course, but what gave her permission to not think twice before acting so pained in public, as though the legitimacy of my argument lay in how it made her feel? This is akin to the logic of several million football fans whose beef with the NFL protests is the fact that these protests interrupt their enjoyment, but the fact that we're being gunned down in the streets be damned. Supplemental to the quality of her hurt was her expression of a deep sadness for me. I had turned my back on the opportunity for a rich cultural connection that her plaintive voice told me she longed for. My thesis had snubbed her wink. What about coalition, she cried. What about solidarity between the races? Now Sandra Dove sat up straight, her cobalt eyes ablaze. She thrust her arm in the air and with her index finger pointed at the wall with the blank projection screen hung and said, what about the picture we saw projected on the screen 1 or 2 sessions before mine? The photo of that beautiful interracial couple, a black man and his white wife, their mixed child from 1967 in Heighton, Ashbury, during the summer of love. Your presentation leaves no room for that photograph. Sorry. My presentation shits on the inspiration of solidarity, I told her. I don't give a rat's ass about solidarity. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's an angry black man right there. The police should have burst in the room right then and there and shot that Negro. They should have shot him. How dare he? How dare he? Dove was an Oxbridge-educated Don who held her head so high as she scolded me she could drown in the rain. As she scolded me, she could drown in the rain. Her eyes widened at the sheer derision of my words. What, she must have wondered, happened to the friendly black face and those snowy teeth that had flashed when she winked the day before? That is so terrible, she groaned. That is such a shame. She went on to tell me that she had recently heard Angela Davis say that she had transcended the slave statue. She said that this 2 or 3 times, and I was about to ask her if she had heard of any other black person or heard of any other black people when Ian Bryce ended the session and said it was time for lunch. Sandra Dove stood up and blocked my way as I tried to leave. She said once again how sad I had made her. She then told me that in the future I needed to consider my audience when I give presentations. Exclamation mark! Listen, I told her, I'm not even talking to anyone in this room, ever. When I talk, I'm talking to black people. I'm just a parasite on the resources, and I need to do work on behalf of black liberation. Just as the world has always been a parasite on me in pursuit of its legibility and sense of presence. But I didn't need to say this, for she had moved to one side. They went to lunch as a group, I did not join them. Instead, I went to lunch with Sebastian, the Canadian graduate student I met by chance the night before on a crowded Berlin street. Together, we debriefed. He was almost as shell shocked as I was by what had just gone down. After lunch, I walked back to the building, collected my things, went back to the hotel and packed. During the afternoon session, Ian Bryce emailed me, "Hi, Frank, are you okay? We're having our final roundtable here. We'd love for you to be here, Ian." One never really knows which is more severe: the blithe disregard one suffers at the hands of white people, or the pious remorse with which they purify themselves. All right. All right, so we're almost at the end of chapter 4, just these last 4 pages. But yeah, I've been in those situations with white liberal people, and I express something that goes against their norms, and they just have to rant and rave about, solidarity or the black friends they have or the people they know. I mean, it's just, it comes with the territory. Comes with the territory of thinking you can have allyship with white people, especially for our liberation and the fight against white supremacy and the destruction of anti-Blackness. Let's go here. So number 8, you think you've seen it all, and you have. You met Sandra Dove when she sipped gin and lemonade and flicked her cigarette out the kitchen window. She called herself Selena Davenport. Selena Davenport was the present that packed her bags to meet you in the future in Berlin, just to say she still didn't like your answers to her questions, that when you speak, she hears only the noise of death drawing water. She winked, mistaking you for Eros, and you betrayed her in the worst way possible, when you could have thrived as a sculpted down duplicate of her desire. Once, in the same tree you were born, Sandra and Selena, Ian and Reg, Li Ling and all the Indians who chaff at the sound of a nigger's voice, gaze up at the branches and say, "Look what you made us do to you." You twitch apologetically. The last seeds of light are dying in your eyes. You look down and feel their pain. Ah, what a deep chapter. That's the end of part 1. When we meet again, we're going to start part 2, because this book, I believe, is broken down into 2 parts. At the end of chapter 4, we just finished that. That was a very moving chapter, very interesting chapter. This is a fun read, hilarious read sometimes. I don't like how sometimes he repeats certain sections of his story and goes a bit too much into detail. I thought it would be better if he just, got straight to some parts. But chapter 4 was an easy read, fun read, interesting read, and we'll start part 2 and chapter 5 in our next reading of Afro-Pessimism. Thank you for watching. If you're watching this on the playback, tune in for more book react that we'll do this year. And my name is Simon Hill. Peace.